The whole Pulitzer thing was unnerving because the spotlight was on us as reporters, and I didn't feel comfortable with that. So it was unnerving. Thought, every story has to be Pulitzer Prize winning material now. And that was troubling to me, that all of a sudden at age 28, you've met a really high standard. And how do you keep that standard up?
That was Pulitzer Prize winner Barbara Walsh, and author of August Gale, a memoir of her grandfather, her father, and a savage 1935 hurricane that devastated Newfoundland. And I'm Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee. Welcome back to another season of Irish Stew and the Global Irish Nation Conversation. This episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by Ireland of the Welcomes magazine, celebrating 70 years of Irish history, tradition, culture, and community with outstanding photography and inspired writing. Get Ireland of the Welcomes delivered to your door or give a gift subscription and keep the Irish legacy alive for generations to come. Subscribe today online at irelandofthewelcomes.com. Welcome back to a new season of Irish Stew. Glad to have you with us again. Looking forward to some great global Irish Nation conversation. We're rolling this out on St. Patrick's Day week, and a lot of Irish activities going on. It's going to be a busy week, and we look forward to celebrating all the good things Irish. And Martin, why don't you kick us off with what we have on tap today?
Hey, John, great to be back, kicking off season 5. And for our very first episode of this new season, I'm delighted to have a guest who is a journalist and an author. And while in her 20s, she won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on a crime story. That story likely changed the outcome of a presidential election. And over the last 20 years, she has continued to report, but has also expanded her brief to writing children's books and a family memoir. Barbara Walsh, tá fáilte rót go dtí an podcréile. Welcome to Irish Stew.
Well, I'm honored to be a part of Irish Stew, and I love the title of your podcast, and I'm Irish American and very proud of it, and so I'm thrilled to be a part of the show. So thank you for inviting me. And I don't know what you just said, Martin, but I assume it was nice and it was Gaelic.
Yeah, we had to throw in a couple of focal, as they say, a couple of words in Irish. And simply it was, welcome to the podcast. Fáilte go dtí an podcréile.
Oh, wonderful.
That's the Irish for podcast?
That is the Irish for podcast,
Oh,
yeah.
That's great.
So I'm going to kick this off, Barbara, with a very simple question. Tell me about your first writing memory.
Well, I don't know. I'd have to guess at my age, but I'd say maybe, 9 or 10. My mother jokes that I never spoke until I was 7 because I was the shy kid and I preferred the written word rather than the spoken word. And so I wrote a lot of poetry. I wrote my uncle 12-page letters, and he thought, wow, this kid, she has a lot of time in her hands. But I love to write. It was my kind of escape into my own little internal world and how I viewed things. And of course, I love to read too. So it was those two things as I was younger, really. And I think I mentioned to you too before, my Nana, who was my father's mother, Patricia Walsh, Patricia O'Connell Walsh, and she was a wonderful storyteller. So I, at an early age, would just sit at her knee and, she could spin tales, of course, that I thought were fiction. And I would later learn in life they were not fiction, and they become, part of a book I would eventually write.
So writing started early, and then you moved along and headed off to college. I think you studied journalism in college. Am I correct?
I did. My high school teachers encouraged me to pursue a writing career, and I thought, well, what are the options? Teach writing or write? And journalism piqued my interest. I started this high school newspaper in Pelham, New Hampshire. And so I wound up at UNH and got a journalism and photography degree. And soon after graduating, I wanted to go to Ireland. That's where my ancestors were from. And I ended up I think it was January 81 with a backpack, never been on a plane, got a one-way ticket to London with goals of ending up in Ireland. And naively, being a journalist, I thought, well, I'm going to infiltrate the IRA and write about them. This is my American dream that, okay, I can do this. But of course, I land in London, never been on a plane, and the little Bobby at the airport says, "Where are you going, love?" And I'm like, I haven't a clue. And I ended up at a youth hostel, burning toast for a month. But eventually I made my way up through Wales and Scotland and caught the ferry to Larne. And the two truck drivers on the ferry said to me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm a journalism graduate and I'm going to write about the IRA." And they're like, "Oh, Jesus." And of course they decided at 8 a.m. we needed a shot of whiskey to celebrate my going to Ireland. But they wouldn't take their eyes off me. They brought me to Belfast. They explained to me, "Don't speak." And that was a time of still barbed wire and unattended cars and packages were blown up. And so they were just, they were from the South, but they were traveling through. And I had a family friends in Dublin. The dad was teaching, and they said, "We're going to bring you to their doorstep," because they just didn't trust me. They didn't want to let me loose in Belfast. They thought you're never going to be seen again. And they're very kind gentlemen. I wish I could give a shout out to them, but they were like my guardian angels when I first landed in Belfast.
The kindness of strangers.
Right. And they knew. They're like, "Oh, God, this girl is trouble. We got to get her to a safe doorstep." But that was my first introduction to Ireland. And I ended up in Dublin with this family and tried to find work and couldn't. And I decided, well, I'll take the train to Galway. I preferred a quieter city and ended up working for the paper there, the Galway Advertiser, as a photographer, and working in a home there, kind of as light housekeeping. So I was scrubbing potatoes and starting the peat fire and making tea, which I was often cursed at as a bloody Egypt because it tasted horrible to them. But that was my first introduction to Ireland.
That's a pretty authentic experience when you're lighting the turf fire,
Oh, gosh. I mean, you're trying to light dirt. And I would use those fire starters, which were expensive. And the woman who was my age, we became good friends. She's like, "You bloody Egypt. Why can't you light that?" And I'd be like, "Because it's dirt. How do I do this?" But I loved it there. I mean, I had a lot of adventures and returned 3 times. And, it was a wonderful, wonderful year for me there.
You mentioned in college, part of your major was photojournalism, and your job in Galway was involved with photography.
Right. It was a strange thing. I couldn't be a writer there because I had to be a part of the union, but I couldn't be part of the union because I wasn't an Irish. But for some reason, I could be a photographer. So I loved it. Photography is also a very strong part of my background. And when I'm writing, I like to see things visually. So photography was similar. And oftentimes later in my career, I would videotape things so I could be back in that moment and hear things and see scenes, because to me, that's the best writing is, you want to put somebody right there with you and to hear things and smell things and to feel those emotions. So I often would my old video camera, I'd be duct taping that and videotaping scenes and as much as I could to put myself back in that moment. But yeah, I think photography, as a writer, it's the old adage is don't tell me, show me. And so I think photography played into that because I always want to create scenes in my stories.
How you frame up the story, right?
Right.
It can make a big difference because depending on where the focus is.
Right. And for me, the numbers, I mean, I'm not a math person anyway, so numbers kind of frighten me. But for me, you could tell me, 3,000 people died of COVID, but give me that story. Give me that one family. Give me that kid who lost both parents, or just, I want the human angle. I want the emotion, and I want people to be haunted by these stories like they should be. And people would often say, I cry when I read your stories. Well, I'm like, that's good, because I cry when I write them. I cry when I interview people. And for me, the goal is just to strike some emotion in my reader, whether it's rage or sadness, or just to feel like, okay, something needs to change here, and to really make them remember that story. Because we are bombarded 24/7 with news, and it's too much. But give me that one story that I'm going to remember.
That's kind of an unusual perspective in a way in the world of journalism where, as I understand it, it's often drilled into students that objectivity is primary, almost to the point that all emotion needs to be squeezed out. Your angle is obviously very different.
Right. And I agree when you're doing a story that's pitting two people against each other or two adversaries, you've got to obviously be fair to both parties. We all have biases. We all grow up in homes and we come from different places. And it's foolish to think that we don't have a bias going into stories. But the biggest thing for me when I learned as a journalist is you've got to do a lot of listening. And going into a story, you think, okay, the story is X. But for me, as my career evolved, I soon learned, oh, that's not the story at all. And I think that's the trick of journalism, that you've really got to be open to listening to people and understanding, and not coming in with this preconceived notion that you're not going to let go of. And again, going into that bias of, I grew up Irish Catholic, and what do I know about other religions in my small town? But to me, the best part of journalism was always learning. I mean, it was just like every day you'd be learning new things. So that was a trick. But I also acknowledge, Martin, that call it from my Irish roots, that I'm an emotional person, and the old, you're not crying, you're cursing and fighting. And I mean, that's me. Like you know where I'm coming from. Like, I'm not going to hide my emotions, and I'm not embarrassed, and I've interviewed people who, have lost their son to suicide, or, lost their dad in COVID and they couldn't say goodbye. I mean, I relate to my dad in hospice holding his hand, and we were there 24/7 for 4 days. And it just killed me that these families couldn't be there. So I put that kind of personal experience into my stories of, good God, if I couldn't say goodbye to my dad and hold his hand, how heartbreaking that would be. So I try to transfer my experiences, how they relate to the story. But obviously, I don't throw my dad in the middle. I did write an essay on that, but I just don't shut my feelings out, because I also think the Lawrence Eagle-Tribune, they'd call me the angel of death. I mean, I could get anybody to talk no matter what the traumatic situation was. And I think part of the reason is because I would always go in and say, I'm sorry. I'm one of 6 girls, and I can't imagine what you're going through, and being authentic, and sometimes crying during those interviews, because, if you don't cry, like, I mean, it'd just be hard for me not to show that emotion. And again, it's not crocodile tears. It's just the heartbreak of whatever I'm covering. And people see that you care. You're not just out there for this headline, but I truly care. And I try to put those feelings into the story.
Barbara, you just mentioned the Lawrence Eagle-Tribune, and of course, that's the publication where you ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize in 1988. Tell us about your start there.
Right. So I was in my mid-20s, hired by the Tribune, and originally, working your way up, you're covering small town politics and having to sit through some god-awful long meetings and saying, I hate this, but it's my job. But again, the more you listen, you would always pick up a story. So eventually I was put on the William Horton Jr. story, and Horton in 1974, he and 2 of his buddies robbed a gas station in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and Joey Fournier, who was 17 at the time, handed over all their money, gave him the money willingly, and he was stabbed 19 times and his body stuffed in a garbage can. And so, of course, Horton and his 2 pals were put away, life without parole. So that means you're never getting out. And so we learn in spring of '87, the Lawrence Eagle-Tribune, which is right next door to Lawrence in North Andover, or Andover, Mass. And we learn Horton escaped from prison. And we're thinking, well, how does that happen? I mean, he's in a secure prison, as he should be. And then we learn Massachusetts was letting killers and rapists out on the weekend, unsupervised. And the reason being, we eventually found out, is because that was as a result of rioting in some of these prisons. They decide, well, if we tell them behave in prison, we'll let you out on the weekend, again, unsupervised, that would help control some of these outbursts in prison. Well, Horton, who was facing, life in prison, decided not to go back during one of these furloughs. And of course, he went to Florida and eventually went to Maryland, where he assumed a new identity, worked as a landscaper, and then stalked this couple who were living together, this young couple, and surprised them, held them hostage, raped the woman twice, tied the fiance up in the basement, stabbed him repeatedly, and they both would have died if not they escaped. And then Horton was in a car chase with police who captured him. But it showed his mentality, and clearly he should not have been released unsupervised. I mean, it was just madness. And so it began a year-long program of, our newspaper trying to find out more about these furloughs. And of course, the prison system, was under fire, and people were outraged, including police who had no idea about this program. Meanwhile, we're writing stories every day. Massachusetts prison system is saying every other state has a similar furlough program. So after I called 50 federal agencies saying, tell me about furloughs across the country, they said, we don't know. So I called every state in the country and said, tell me about your furlough program. And do you let killers and rapists out on the weekend? And they're like, no. Massachusetts was the only one doing this. Furloughs were designed for people getting out of prison to look for a home or job, not for killers like Horton. So it clearly, was a law that was put on the books that few people knew about and few people understood. And then during that time period, George Bush Sr., was running for president. And all of a sudden, we're getting phone calls in the newsroom from this guy named Newt. And we're like, who is this guy Newt? At the time, Newt Gingrich was not, was well known. And they were very interested in those Horton stories. So we soon learned that was going to be part of the national presidential debate. And here's George Bush talking about Dukakis letting killers and rapists out on the weekend. So it evolved into quite the campaign issue. And there's some commercials out there, The Revolving Door, which has Horton's face. And, it was a very intimidating commercial. A lot of people said it was racist. Here's a black man who was accused of raping a white woman in Maryland. So it played into all those stereotypes. And Bush's campaign manager, Lee Atwater, had said he knew Horton was gold for this campaign. And he said, I'm going to make Willie Horton a household name. And he did. Yep. And that really affected the election. And as we all know, Dukakis was not elected to serve in the White House that year.
Yeah, so Mike Dukakis, of course, was the governor of Massachusetts at the time and the Democratic nominee.
Right.
And as I understand it, in the summer of '88, leading into the election against George Bush Sr., he was leading the election, the polling, by something like 15 percentage points, and ultimately lost by 7 percentage points. Now, most political commentators, looking back at that 1988 election, believed that the Willie Horton ad changed the actual outcome of the election. I was interested to note that when you referred to Horton, you referred to him as William Horton. And the use of the first name Willie in some respects was considered to be racist.
Right.
So I assume that that's the name that you used in your reporting, but
exactly.
I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
No, I totally, those ads, I mean, I still, I'll Google that once in a while, and it clearly plays on fears and stereotypes and racism attitudes. But our reporting, we did call him William Horton Jr. because that Willie, and Horton has talked about this in stories since, Willie is obviously sort of a, again, a stereotypical derogatory. Some people could look at it like that. So we always
juvenile, kind of juvenile.
Exactly, like boy, and so, but it didn't matter for our journalism, if Horton was purple, he was still someone that never should have been let out of prison to do these horrible things to this Maryland couple. And it clearly exposed Massachusetts furlough program, which again, our newspaper wrote about for over a year. And killers and rapists don't get out in Massachusetts anymore on the weekend. And that law was changed because of our coverage. So I am proud of the work we did and just explaining what's going on here. And so it was definitely, as a journalist who was only 28 years old, it was quite a lesson in how powerful stories can be, and how much responsibility journalists have. And I told Martin the story when I was sent out to cover the trial in Maryland, with Horton, who was accused of rape and attempted murder, and the police car crash, and reporters out there really didn't know much about Horton. So I was the only one in the courtroom, very small, and Horton knew who I was because his family was sending stories that we had written. So, of course, my editor, Horton, was convicted, and the judge out there, who was very quotable and on CNN often, said as he was sentencing Horton that, tell Massachusetts don't leave the porch light on because, William Horton is never coming home. It was just classic. But my editor said, get an interview with them after the conviction. And I said, okay. And of course, they agreed, which is great. On the flip side, here's Horton, who knows where I am and who I am. And so, of course, I get into the prison and the doors are clanging, and I have no idea what the setup is when I interview him. In a room together, separated by glass, and thankfully we were. And again, being a young reporter, one of my first questions I asked him, as we're separated by glass, and I said, how did you get out on furlough? You weren't a great prisoner. He was in fights, he was doing drugs, and he starts screaming and stands up and is about to leave, and I'm thinking, oh God, I just blew it. And I'm like, well, how's your family? How's your mother? I was just trying to calm him down. And he had me rip up my notebook pages that I'd scribbled on. And of course, the interview continued, and he said to me, I'm not a monster. And I'm quietly thinking, well, I beg to differ. But and then it came around. I asked about furloughs again, and he exploded and was taken away screaming. So that was the last I saw of him. But I do think, despite he's supposedly a good prisoner now and discovered, many things in prison, but Horton's the kind of person that belongs in prison for his crimes.
You mentioned something that was going to be kind of my next question about the power and responsibility of journalists that you recognized. What do you think the state of that is today in journalism today? That imperative.
Well, I think there's a lot of shameful journalism, and obviously the recent case with Dominion suing Fox News, and the recent reporting on that they privately thought, this election, the big steal is all a bunch of garbage, but then they're going on and saying, because of the ratings, fueling those fantasies. And I just think it's not journalism. It's just, I don't know what to call it, but it's shameful. And it really makes me cringe because, as a journalist, you often hear, oh, the media. I think the media can and still does great work. The New York Times coverage of, Ukraine's war, and, the Washington Post. They're certainly, giants in the journalism world. So I think there's still wonderful, compelling stories being told, again, in Maine. There's great newspapers and great journalists, but, things like that, you're blatantly lying for ratings. It makes me sick.
And a lot of bloviating. So many of the television, cable news, they're not journalists, which is okay. You can have a certain point of view, but there's just so many of the voices coming at you that have a point of view that don't have that journalistic
right. There's no substance. And now I tend not to watch TV news. I watch occasionally CNN, but not. I get NPR is kind of what I listen to, right. And it reminds me when I was living in Ireland, my friend, she constantly had the Irish radio on. And, while you're multitasking, and I love that. And, so for me, NPR, National Public Radio, is, again, people criticize them for being more liberal, but there's substance to their stories. So that's where I get most of my news. And, I read the New York Times every day and local Maine papers in New England as well. But I'm not, watching TV news gives me a headache. It's all doom and gloom. And there's a lot more out there.
I will admit to being a NPR addict as well. But before we move on from the Horton case, can you talk a bit about the weaponization of that piece of journalism? You mentioned that Newt Gingrich, who I don't think at the time was Speaker of the House, but was going to become the Speaker of the House and one of the most politically powerful men ultimately in the United States, was calling up your newsroom looking for more details on the Horton case. Tell me about the repercussions to you personally. Were you on the receiving end of angry Democrats that your story had undermined Michael Dukakis? Were you called out for being racist? And what does that do to somebody? You're only in your 20s. You're still pretty darn young, and you've won a Pulitzer Prize. So talk about the outcome of all this.
Well, it was overwhelming. I mean, the whole Pulitzer thing, and again, I'll harken it back to being Irish. It's kind of like after we won, there was so much attention on us. And as a journalist, that's very unusual. You're the one asking questions, you're writing stories, but all of a sudden, myself and this other reporter, Susan Forrest, who had worked a lot on the story, we both kind of came in at different points on it, but we were on like the cover of Boston Magazine. We were being interviewed by the Boston Globe. We were, on radio shows, and it was very unnerving because, again, we were just doing our jobs and following a story, and we were led by terrific editors, and so then eventually, people started saying, well, the Horton story was racist, and I think that stems from, like you say, the campaign. And I'll stand by every story I wrote. There was nothing, again, Horton was Black. Those campaign commercials were definitely, Atwater knew what they were doing. I mean, that was kind of like the first example of how you can take a story of crime, and put fear in people's minds and really affect a national election like that, and just get into people's heads of, Horton did become a household name. People knew. And like you say, Dukakis was ahead, and he just thought, well, I didn't create the law. It's not a bad law. But clearly, all of this campaigning and then the national debate. So we were, in news stories. I was never attacked personally. People never come up to me, whether it was a Democrat or, someone else. But there were stories after that said, that questioned our coverage. But again, it was, Horton clearly was sick, and it was just real simple. Like, you don't want someone like that being released from prison. So the whole Pulitzer thing was unnerving because, again, the spotlight was on us as reporters, and I didn't feel comfortable with that. So it was more, for me, that was unnerving that, I thought, every story has to be Pulitzer Prize winning material now. And that was kind of troubling to me, that all of a sudden at age 28, you've met a really high standard. And how do you keep that standard up? And I certainly think through the years after, that affected, my stories. I always wanted to make sure they're accurate, they were fair. And then I knew like the potential of how a story could change lives and laws. So I always carried that with me. But no, I was never, I feel comfortable with what we did. And, I definitely think those commercials played on the race card, and they became kind of a, people looked at that campaign and said, oh, this is the way to go. Like, this became like a platform for people to kind of go after issues and really stir fear, and especially with crime.
I'd like to take you into the next section that we want to talk about, is your book, your other kinds of writing. And as we kind of segue from journalism into the book you wrote, from the kind of objective viewpoint of a journalist to the more personal viewpoint of, to a certain extent, a memoirist. One thing I picked up in reading about you is it seems you have quite an aversion to deadlines. So you move from the deadline charged world of journalism to where you're putting the deadline on yourself. How did you make that segue?
Well, the deadline thing is funny because any editor that listens to this podcast will be like, yeah, Barbara's a pain in the ass with a deadline. I always push deadline to the extreme. There was a scene in the Lawrence newsroom, and this is back in the day. It was publishing in the afternoon, and there was a shootout on the streets of Lawrence. And so I had a phone to each ear from two reporters, and I'm trying to type on deadline. And this is in the old days when the newspaper was printed, in that building. And the red light would go on when they started the presses. And so I'm trying to write poetic because, I'm Irish. I want everything to be pretty in my stories. I want the words to be beautiful. And I'm trying to write, it was a beautiful morning in the streets of Lawrence and gunfire erupted. And I see the editor who looked like Lou Grant and was just as tough coming out of his newsroom, his office. And he's like, the red light's flashing. And he's like, Walsh. And I'm like, what? He's like, what the hell are you doing? The presses are going. We got to write this. And he's like, there was a shootout on the streets of Lawrence today. Period. One person was shot. Period. Police have arrested 2 men. Period. No other details are known. Period. Send the goddamn story. And I'm sitting there like, okay, boss. But deadline, I guess I'll admit, I want my stories to be as perfect and as powerful as they can be. And so I agonize over every word. And so in college, I missed a magazine writing deadline. And this was back before cell phones and internet. And I thought, well, I had a few more days to finish my magazine story. I turned it in. The professor said, I'm giving you an F. Grades are closed. And I looked at him like, and I'm a junior in writing journalism major. And he said, maybe you ought to pursue photography instead. And I walked out of there like, I just didn't know what to say. And my dad told me, he was like, you're a writer. You have a gift. And if it wasn't for him, I don't know if I would have continued because my confidence was shattered. But that's where the deadline phobia comes in. Mm-hmm. Not that I don't like to push deadlines, but on top of it, I missed a deadline. And here's a professor saying, maybe you ought to pursue photography instead. And so that was always in the back of my head. But it's kind of parallels with, I want every story to be, you got to literally rip it away from me, and I've had many editors screaming at me like, that's it, finish the goddamn story, so and then, segueing to books, The August Gale, which is, I've written children's book, but that's my, nonfiction, kind of like The Perfect Storm. And as Martin said, my memoir, I'd been writing stories that took me a year, like, a series about alcoholism in Maine or domestic violence or teen suicide, all uplifting things. But as I explained to my daughters, there's always good things. There's always change when you write about, dark stories and awaken people to what's happening. But anyway, I'd seen The Perfect Storm and I knew, I was like, I want to write stories like that. I want to write a book. And so when I told that to my dad one night, he said, you have a story like that in your family. And he starts telling me about my ancestors in Newfoundland, which I had never known anything about because my dad's father, who was born in Marystown, abandoned my dad, my uncle, and Nana twice. So he never spoke about him. And I was 18 before I realized, I'd say, where's Grandpa to my Nana? And she'd say he's dead. When I was 18, my dad said, no, he's in California with another family. So, but it was dropped, nothing was ever spoken again until this night when I said to my dad, I want to write books. And he said, you have a story like this in your family. And then he agrees to contact the Newfoundland family. And I'm like, what? Ambrose's family? Like all of a sudden I'm just stunned. And that led to 9 years of traveling to Newfoundland with my dad and my sister and, researching. And I went twice more to Newfoundland on my own and, interviewed my dad's family, including Ambrose's daughters in California, to piece together my dad's childhood. And we traveled to Brooklyn and Staten Island and, places where my dad had lived as a kid, Red Hook, where Ambrose abandoned them the first time. And those stories that my Nana told me when I was a little girl, she used to say to me, she'd say, oh, there were rats running around up and down the stairs. And the mafia used to look out for us. And I'm thinking, these are stories. My Nana's just spinning yarns. These were real stories. After Ambrose left them, in the mid 40s, yeah, I think they had no money. They were penniless. And my Nana did rely on, charitable Catholic organizations. She'd go to church to pray. And yeah, there were rats in the stairway, and the mob was kind of looking after them. And so years later, I'm learning all about my father's childhood pain. And, 6 months later, Ambrose says, and the reason he left with his mistress who had their baby. They go to San Francisco. And then, 6 months later, Ambrose calls and says, I miss you, come out with my sons. My dad was about 12. My Uncle Bill was about 2, actually, maybe more like 13 and, 4. And they go out there. And of course, things are okay for a while. And then the mistress is pregnant again. The mistress is coming to have tea with my Nana, which just shows you. I mean, she was an angel that couldn't turn anybody away. So the mistress is upset because Nana is there with my dad and uncle, and she's having tea. But it eventually got so bad. My grandfather was a gambler. So my dad would see him on the streets and hate him for what he was doing. But, he'd give him a few coins and disappear into this darkened, bookie joint. And then my dad would go back, and, my Nana was in bed. She wouldn't get out of bed. And she nearly jumped out the window. And it was, of course, a Catholic priest that said to her, Mrs. Walsh, the state's going to take your children if you don't come out of this. So they were wired money and went back to Massachusetts. But that's the memoir side of August Gale. But it just was really emotional for me to be, I've interviewed killers and, families that lost people tragically. But I'm interviewing my dad now about his childhood pain. And I kept saying, Dad, I'm afraid I'm going to hurt you. He said, don't worry, I trust you. And I'm thinking, oh God, I'm a reporter. I've got to tell the story. I've got to tell the truth. And so the other flip side is the Newfoundland piece, which is, I like to say the book is about 2 storms, the family storm and the Newfoundland storm, which in 1935, an August Gale roared up the coast. And the dorymen, the fishermen, my great uncle, Captain Paddy, who again, all these Irish people went to Newfoundland. And so many of my ancestors came over and, became fishermen there. And Captain Paddy Walsh was, of course, legendary cod fisherman. And this particular storm, there were 2 ships going out. He was with his sons, who were 12 and 14, and a crew of 4 other men. And then there was his son, James, who was captaining his own ship for the first time. So they're going out, and there's no, all they have is their awareness of the sea. And the dory ship are going out, and all of a sudden the anchors are twirling, and there's something bad coming. And so the story is also about, the storm that, took, affected 300 families in this small town of Marystown. 14 men were gone, 2 kids. And, so it was a historic loss. And so I went out to interview, and it was just incredible, interviewing people about that gale and sort of the waves that come over the mast, and very few survived that storm. So that was my, like you say, it took me 9 years to write it because I was working full time as a journalist with young daughters. But it was probably the most emotional story because it was my family.
Talk to me a little bit about the linkage in your book. So you tell the 2 stories in parallel. You tell the story of your father and his abandonment by his father, your grandfather, Ambrose. Your father is Ronnie. And the storm itself. Do you see any linkage between those 2 things? Because in the opening phase of the book, you talk about your grandfather being, I believe, in Brooklyn, and sitting on a bench and seeing a newspaper twirling around in the wind. Do you see your father's abandonment to some degree linked to this horrendous hurricane in 1935 that killed, 14 men, 12 men and 2 children out of a small village in Newfoundland?
Right. And people have asked, and my grandfather was dead long before I started this story. So I could never ask him, but people and I speculated too. And I don't want to give away too much in the book, but Ambrose did lose his brother, his nephews, his cousins. He lost, I mean, Marystown was, village of 500, and 42 children had lost fathers in this storm. And it was just crippling to that community and the grief. So Ambrose, here he is, and you're right, he's on a pier in Brooklyn, and this newspaper is just twirling at his feet. And he reads the headline, and this was a real paper that I later found in archives, several feared dead in, Newfoundland. And he knows his brother, Captain Patty, who was sort of like a father to Ambrose, is out in that storm. He knows, Patty's sons, 3 sons are out in that gale, and he knows his cousins are out there. And so I think the pain from that storm, clearly was something that probably affected Ambrose all his life, that huge loss. And he couldn't afford the money to go back for any of the wakes or the funerals. So that's also, I think a wound that never healed. He was never able to say goodbye. So I definitely think it affected him, that storm. And it was entwined because, as my dad grew up, and the pain of, his hero was Ambrose. Ambrose abandoned him twice, and then he saw the pain that his mother went through. So it kind of reverberated through generations, and it's kind of, I believe it was fate that I was supposed to write about this. I went to Newfoundland to search for my grandfather, who I'd never met and never seen pictures of until I started research on this book.
There's you've spent time in Ireland and you spent time in Newfoundland, and we know there's a very strong connection between those two areas. Did it feel like an outpost of Ireland in some ways?
Oh, it did, for sure. Which I love, because I felt like I was right back in Ireland. And, it just, the way they spoke, it was the sing-song kind of lyrical Irish, and the hospitality. And of course, everyone knew we were coming to this small village. I mean, Marystown is still, not that big. I mean, obviously it's grown, but it's not an easy place to get to. It's down on the Burin Peninsula. But the minute we pulled, and of course our relatives were waiting for us. We were staying at their camp, and so people in that community, I all knew we were coming, and we all look alike. The dark hair and the mannerisms. And so, of course, we pulled into town, and of course, en route, you're going down the, nothing but scrub brush. And, my dad's like, where the hell are we? And, we get there, and it's just getting dark. And, eventually we pull in front of Captain Patty's house, which is this just gorgeous historic home. It was an old hotel that he ended up buying. But, I'm just like seeing the house, and all of a sudden this fellow comes down and, you're the Walshes. And, they all knew us, and they started saying, you're related. We were related to everybody in that village. It was just, you're my second, third, fourth, fifth cousin. And I lost track, but I have a lot of cousins there. But the hospitality, the Brentons who took us in, our relatives, and they couldn't do enough for us. And so it was sort of 5 days of crazy nonstop interviewing. But I felt like I was right back in Ireland. And, again, in Newfoundland, they say, welcome home. And my dad kept saying, this isn't home, but to them, it's our home. That's where, his roots began, I mean, from Ireland to Newfoundland, but it was just, they still can say, like, when are you coming home? And I've been back several times, but I love it. And of course, my cousin Jack Brenton took me one night to St. George's Street in St. John's, which is a fabulous city. And of course, we, lots of Irish music everywhere, and we're out far too late, eating French fries at, 2 a.m. So I did feel like I was right back in Ireland. And then the music, and again, the people and the storytelling. And the music, it's just everything. I love going there, and I'm due for a trip back there and a trip back to Ireland as well.
One of the interesting things about your book, which I don't think you were was necessarily central to the book, but I get the sense of the economics of the time, the Great Depression, right? 1935, this hurricane roars into Newfoundland and just causes awful devastation. But your grandfather, Ambrose, is also working down in New York in the 1930s. And you get a sense of living from hand to mouth with all these people in a way that is foreign. And at the end of the book, you kind of talk about the women who have lost their husbands being fearful that their children were going to be taken away from them because they can't put, food in their mouths. So was that purposeful, or, was that just background?
Well, no, I mean, it paralleled the story of these women in the village who suddenly lost, their husbands, and they had, 5 kids or whatever. And they would say, I mean, and back then, in 1935, you weren't getting too much money from the government to help you out. So they had to rely on, the vegetables and any fish they could get. But, when the constables would come around and, the women would put boiling water on the stove and say, oh, no, dinner's cooking. I mean, there was nothing to put in that pot. And the constables would say, we're going to take your kids. And, they'd say, no, they're going to die here before you take them. And some kids did end up in the orphanage, but it paralleled kind of what my Nana was going through. I mean, she, in Red Hook, just no money, and really struggled, relied on charities and tried to work herself. And then again in California, I mean, she's in a place where she knows no one and trying to figure out how to feed her sons and deal with her depression. And so as I was writing the book, it paralleled, here's my Nana in a strange place all alone, and, her husband abandons her again. So, but the men, lost at sea, obviously. I mean, that wasn't their choice to, die there, but it just the struggle, as you say, Martin, times were tough. I mean, it was just after the Depression, and, in that small village of Marystown, there was not a lot of money anyway. And, for my Nana, being a single woman in the 40s, that wasn't common. And so when, I related to, these women struggling somehow to feed their kids and try to fend off the government, just like my Nana. I mean, that priest said, we're going to take your kids. You don't snap out of this. And, so and again, it was always family, like that village, people tried to help one another. And again, I don't want to give away too much, but Captain Patty's wife, she lost a husband and 3 sons. And, those stories, I mean, I was interviewing people in their 80s and 90s. And of course, I had to do a lot of shouting, just shouting at people there, say, what? But the stories, they all remembered Captain Patty's wife, Lillian, just screaming, just, for nights on end. And of course, all of the Irish connections of spirits, a lot of them saw spirits. They saw their fathers, they saw their husbands. And they certainly had the superstitions of, no women on the boats, and you don't wave to your man. You don't flip a bread tin over because that's bad luck. Your husband's ship may flip. But the Irishness and the connections of, certainly the Catholic religion and the priest. And that was another thing, the priest having to go knock on these doors in Marystown. I mean, literally, and say your dad's died, your son's died. You've lost 3 sons and a husband. And it was just incredible for these women, like you say, to somehow persevere. And they did. I mean, most of them, they found ways to feed their kids.
Is there any kind of memorial in the town now, a plaque, a statue?
Well, they're working on, and this is something I need to check on, because they were working on a memorial with all the names that were lost. Because it's Marystown, and I was trying to urge them to do sort of historical markers around the community as well. Like, here was Captain Patty's house, and, just because back in the day, schooners and dories just filled that bay in Marystown. It was just, that was their livelihood, and cod was king. They would come home, and like I say, Captain Patty was, they're all Irish Catholic, and the men would bring their rosaries and holy water. So when the waves would rise, they would throw that into the sea to calm them. Captain Patty would climb to the top of the mast and shout at God, "I'm not afraid of you." And here's these Catholic fishermen saying, "Come down, Patty." But the storytelling of, to me, the connections of, fishermen in Ireland and fishermen in Newfoundland, and is all very rich in similar themes to me, of ties to religion and superstitions and the spirits. So, like I say, some people believe in that and not. But I didn't want my book to read like a Stephen King novel, but it seemed like a fair amount of people felt the presence of these lost men.
Well, the memorial and the historic marker sound like a great idea, but until then, there is a monument to that in your book, August Gale. As we get to this point of the program, unfortunately, we have to close with your shameless plug. What should our listeners do for you? Where should we direct them to?
Well, of course, I would love for them to read August Gale, and I still do many book talks and Zoom. I do book clubs and so forth. But my dad, who has since passed away in 2016, before I even started writing the book, we were all familiar with the stories and the scenes and convinced this is a movie. It's dramatic, it's emotional, it's visual, lots of great, authentic, true characters. So my dad picked Paul Newman to play him. And of course, my sisters were, talking about different characters to play them as well. But my dad, who was one of my biggest fans and promoting the book and handing out bookmarks, we always said, we're going to get this movie made. And so I've written a movie script. It's not my forte, but I am continually trying to figure out ways to get this on the screen. And potentially, people say, Barbara, maybe it's better on Netflix because the book does go back and forth in time, which you really can't do much of in a movie. You don't want to confuse visually. But so that's my shameless plug is I want to see August Gale on the screen. And whether it's a movie or streaming, Netflix, Amazon Prime, everyone that reads the book is just like, this would make a great movie. I mean, it's not just me, it's just kind of visual and dramatic. So that's one of my goals, and being Irish and stubborn, and I won't give up on it.
We have some filmmakers in our Irish Stew alumni roster. Let's see what we can do.
That'd be wonderful. We'll get you guys out there in dories.
Absolutely. Extras.
You can be fending off the storm.
We'll be extras.
And so with that, Barbara Walsh, I would like to thank you for taking the time to sit with us and tell us something about your life story and your wonderful memoir, August Gale. I love the book. There's a lot more meat in that book that we didn't even get to touch upon, but you got to keep something fresh. But it's been a real pleasure hearing about your story. We look forward to seeing a version of this story on Netflix. So any listeners out there, if you know somebody that is in the movie making business or trying to get or familiar with how to get a great story on Netflix, here's your opportunity to work with a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. So thank you, Barbara. I look forward to speaking again.
Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you. You're wonderful. And I will certainly be a loyal fan to the Irish Stew.
Martin, Barbara was talking about the sort of the Irish spirits that she was uncovering in her book, August Gale, the way they look back and they saw their ancestors in their time of peril. When she told an earlier story from her career, I think she found a couple of other Irish spiritual entities when she was on her way to Belfast to infiltrate the IRA as a journalist. And two folks she met on the boat sort of took her under her wing and kept her from harm's way. I think they might have been spirits as well.
Sometimes you have guardian angels around you and you don't even realize it. I think that particular story is a testimony to how welcoming people can be of Irish origin. And indeed, anybody that has any understanding of Irish history understands the hardships that Irish people have faced over the course of their lives, whether it is in Ireland, whether it is immigrants to the United States, or in this case, immigrants to Newfoundland. And that kind of welcoming hospitality that you see all the time from Ireland certainly resonates with me.
Yeah, it was great to be able to dip our toe into that global Irish outpost in Newfoundland, and hopefully we'll go back for more.
I'm looking forward to that, and delighted to have our first Pulitzer Prize winning journalist on Irish Stew. Hopefully the first of many other firsts going forward.
And a few of those firsts are going to happen in the next few weeks as we get into our new season, and we really welcome you all back, and thanks for listening.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.